Welcome to PSR, People Speaking Rail. And we are those people. I'm Mike Baudendistel, joined by Joanna Furlough Marsh. Joanna, you've been talking a lot about furloughs at Union Pacific. We do have a lot to say about Union Pacific today. So that's where I'm going to start off. So you talked a little bit about it this morning on FreightWaves Now. UP announced maintenance away furloughs. You have an article up as of yesterday, which shows Union Pacific locomotive piece of on the art there. So, what can you tell me about this at a high level?
Yeah, let me see. So the Brotherhood of Maintenance of Way Employees Division had reached out to the Surface Transportation Board in mid-late October, mentioning that there could be as many as uh, over 1,300 union members, so maintenance of way workers, furloughed in the upcoming fourth, months of the fourth quarter. Um, and actually, this question of furloughs was brought up at the Rail Trends conference, Tony Hatch's Rail Trends conference
Mhm.
in New York. And so, if you look back at some of the one of the articles written by our colleague John Kingston, it does refer to furloughs there. It doesn't really name specifically those, the over 1,000 ones, but um,
Mhm.
um, according to UP, the furloughs that are mentioned in the article are actually the ones that the maintenance of way folks are concerned about. So yeah, and so of course, UP responded to those, saying, those furlough concerns, and then I think the union sent a second letter after that Rail Trends conference, kind of kind of expressing their concern about how furloughs could affect not just new hires, but also, because it's over 1,000 people who could be affected. Um,
Mhm.
it could affect not only just like new hires, but those who have been on the job for a while. So you're kind of so there's a concern from the unions about how that would affect sort of expertise and experience at the railroad. So yeah, and I mean, you know, Union Pacific has declined to say exactly how many people could be furloughed. They said, well, you have to factor in the vacation time, and whether those who get called back will return to those positions, or if they'll move elsewhere in the network, like doing something else. Um, and so they were hesitant to pinpoint a number or even a range of how many people could be affected by this. But the union spokesperson said yesterday that that they're planning to talk to Union Pacific this week, and so I'm not sure exactly what will happen at that discussion, but perhaps, if it is about, well, obviously it will be about furloughs, but but if there are furloughs pending, like what sort of terms can be arranged uh, um, to sort of ease the pain, or just, I'm not sure exactly, but
Yeah, I mean, there were some interesting things that came out of this. I mean, it's interesting. It seemed like the street liked it. If you look at a stock chart the last few days, Union Pacific has picked up some steam. I mean, it's still underperforming versus the S&P year to date, up about 12% versus S&P up about 18%. You see Union Pacific stock in black there, and you see the past few days was up. So this is from, this as of, late yesterday, up a little bit, up 1%. Let's call it. But so it seems like, is the question that the railroads are going back to the old playbook that Jim Vena is proponent of, PSR, which means to a lot of people, reducing costs, minimizing the operating ratio, sort of this range that you give in your article, 1,180 to 1,350 people. That would be something like a 16.7% cut to the number of maintenance of way workers. And you think of maintenance of way workers as basically people that are maintaining the track, which is a very capital intensive, portion of what the railroads do. There's also an interesting chart you have in here on a total employees, comparison of total employees versus maintenance of way employees at Union Pacific, and sort of the total number of employees is this orange line on the right axis. So there's just under 35,000. I looked at their 10K, and it said 33,179 as of the end of 2022. And then the blue lines are maintenance of way workers. And so if you sort of look at the entirety of the chart, it's kind of like, well, they've kind of been, reduced in proportion to the total. Maybe at times they were reduced a little bit more in 2018, a little bit less in 2019, 2020. But another thing that's interesting about this is you look at the number today versus go back to right before the pandemic, and it looks pretty similar to me, or even a little bit less than where it was, let's say, December 2019. I mean, certainly it's less in terms of total number of employees, but it even looks less a little bit in terms of the maintenance employees. So it does make you wonder: are they, doing enough in maintenance? And the other thing I thought that was interesting was that, I guess, in your article, I mean, one of the reasons that Union Pacific gave for the furloughs in terms of like why now is they cited this tropical storm, Hillary in Southern California prompted Union Pacific to cut back on spending for budgetary reasons. And I guess intuitively, I would think that if there was a storm that was disrupted, you would need more maintenance of way workers, because you would have to maintain the track, maybe repair the track, maybe make sure that the geometry is correct, all of those things. So what did you think about that as a reason for this?
Yeah, so all that correspondence I think is unavailable on the Surface Transportation Board website, so you can, so people can look at what uh, both Union Pacific and the Brotherhood of Maintenance of Way Union, what they submitted to the board. I think according according to the union submissions, it's their opinion is that UP spent all the money it did on, it had a budget, and it spent most of its budget on the first three quarters, and then when the fourth quarter came, they
Mhm,
realized they
mhm,
didn't have enough. So
mhm,
that's kind of, I think that's essentially what how they interpret things. Um, and then I should also mention that Union Pacific is also arguing that, some of these positions are seasonal, and so as as people, people are aware, the rail industry has, in the past, uh, conducted furloughs on a seasonal basis. They haven't done that in
mhm,
several years, but that is something that has been done in the past. So they're kind of, referring to the older way of doing things, which is kind of what you were, talking about, with that
mhm.
focus on addressing, the operating ratio of that way.
Mhm. Yeah, a couple other stats here I think are interesting is you look at their volume, and I wouldn't have thought that this would have been a tremendous amount of variance relative to what they were budgeting. So you look at sort of carload volume year to date, Union Pacific is down 0.4%. So not a tremendous amount, less than half a percent in terms of the rail carloads. Look, intermodal units down 3.1% year to date. Maybe that was a negative variance overall relative to their budget. But both of those things in total, it's surprising that would require 16 or 17% reduction in maintenance of way workers, and both of those volume metrics actually better than the BNSF. Interestingly, BNSF had sharper declines than that. And I guess the question is this sort of an issue of, well, the cult of the OR is back, as Tony Hatch likes to say. He likes to use that phrase. So I'll ask him that when we have him on the show next week. But then the other question is, well, when they want these workers back from the furloughs, let's say more maintenance work needs to be done. Let's say volumes grow, next year or the year after. Will they come back, or are they just going to find something else to do and they'll be happy doing those other things? I think that's kind of the key question. Now, and the railroads used to be able to seemingly furlough the workers they needed to furlough without a lot of pushback from the STB. Now there is that pushback, but chairman of the STB is not going to seek reelection. Will the others be quite as adamant that this is not a practice that should continue. So I can sort of see it both ways, but there does need to be some flexibility, I think, in terms of being staffed for the right amount of the work that needs to be done, because it is difficult to predict volume. It is difficult to predict some of these weather events. But want to move on to another article that you wrote last few days. Union Pacific, also sticking with Union Pacific here, they're opening a Phoenix terminal, Phoenix intermodal terminal, and expanding on dock capabilities in Houston for intermodal. And some of the highlights here is they're going to start with a hub that's designed for international intermodal. So let's talk 40-foot containers, 20-foot containers in Phoenix, with the potential to expand into domestic intermodal at some point in the future. The idea is they have connections between ports of LA and Long Beach versus consumption centers in the Southwest. You also mentioned that BNSF was looking at Phoenix, looking to acquire about 3,000 acres last year. And then there's this other initiative that is quasi-related to it, also on intermodal, where they're doing more on-dock rail from the Port of Houston. We know the Port of Houston has been perhaps the fastest growing port in North America. Maybe Prince Rupert might be the other one. And some of these are that you see on the map here, for those looking at the visual part of it. Some of these are traditional locations like Chicago, so that Global 4 terminal, Kansas City. But then some of these other destinations are relatively new, and really not ones that have a tremendous amount of intermodal volume. And sort of that Phoenix location we're just talking about, not a tremendous amount of intermodal volume as of yet. Same thing with Salt Lake City, Denver, some of those locations, population growing very quickly, not a lot of intermodal in and out of those locations. We did hear at our conference in Chattanooga, F3, that JB Hunt, which uses BNSF, they were talking about expanding their services into Phoenix and Denver. So a lot of these cities in the Mountain Time Zone, they do seem to be growth areas within the intermodal sector. And I think that's something that, if you're going to make a list of sort of reasons why intermodal is still a growth area within transportation, reasons why it's not, I think a lot of these initiatives are really the reasons why intermodal is potentially still a growth area.
Mhm. Yeah, I think so. And I think, you still have that wider argument about, trying to the proverbial, trying to win back share from trucks or something. And so, I mean, if you don't
Mhm.
build it, they won't come. So, I mean, at
Yeah.
the very least, you have that option. And it is interesting, actually, that you've pointed out, the mountain time zone cities, considering, because there's been a lot of noise about connecting like the southeast with Mexico, and so um,
Mhm.
um,
Mhm.
so so you have this other region here, and then it kind of and it just kind of then just kind of looking at it even sort of more from a, I can't think of the term now, but I'm just thinking about all these arrangements that have been that been made for intermodal, since the Canadian Pacific Kansas City Southern merger. And granted, they're not exactly it's not the same competition necessarily, like these it looks like, just looking at the map right now with the Union Pacific, I mean, it's not necessarily that it's they're going to be competing with like CPKC, but it's just
Mhm.
that idea of a more north south uh, access, I think is interesting.
Yeah, there really have been a lot of partnerships announced between the various railroads, and you wonder if any of those would have been announced without CPKC. Was it just a competitive response to CPKC? The other thing that's interesting about some of those cities on that map is they're really centers of consumption. When you sort of think about how intermodal might compete with truckload, they're really deeply backhaul markets. So more freight goes into those cities than comes out of those cities. So they're not desirable if you're a long haul trucker and you see, load that's being tendered, it's going to take you to Denver. That's pretty undesirable. It's almost always a backhaul market. Phoenix is too, Salt Lake is too. Phoenix is maybe changing a little bit because there's been more sort of beverage production, but most of those cities in that mountain time zone, there's a lot more freight that goes in that goes out. So it seems like that's one where it can be at times very expensive to source, inbound freight into those cities. So intermodal, the rails hauling is handling the long haul portion of the move. You just have a local drayage company, within that city. That seems a lot easier to deal with. I want to move on to this other article you wrote on, Wednesday of last week. You're talking about the chances for the Senate to move forward on a rail safety bill. It seems unlikely by the end of this year. And you think back to earlier this year, like one of the big events of 2023 was this East Palestine, Ohio derailment, which got to be a bigger deal because of just how much black smoke it caused. The pictures were pretty dramatic because there was a controlled burn. The first responders decided that was the safest approach, was to burn those chemicals. You could take a picture of that from the airplane. And it seemed almost certain back in the early part of the year, back in the first quarter, that there would be some rail safety legislation. And here we are now in December, and the status, it just seems like it's maybe not a priority anymore, even though there was a derailment caused potentially by a similar issue on CSX not long ago. I mean, it seems like the issue was that the wheel bearings heated up to a level that created fire, and it wasn't detected in time by the sensor. But are you surprised at all? I mean, did you think that those would be that you would have legislation, by now? And do you think it's still a 2024 event, this Rail Safety Act, or do you think this is just something that is just never going to be a high priority?
Yeah, it's funny because, like, on one hand, like, I'm of two minds. Like, because on one hand, I did think, that it seemed like that there was a lot of momentum going forward, for a while, like for those several weeks after East Palestine. But then it just seemed, after that vote through the Senate Commerce Committee, that it just, well, seeing, I think that vote found mostly along party lines, kind of was my
Mhm.
me personally, just kind of my the inkling of, I'm not sure how this is going to go, because, you know when they first introduced the bill, and even when it passed the Commerce Committee, they're sort of touting it as a bipartisan bill, but really what it was just, JD Vance of Ohio, who is a Republican, signing on to this bill that was been mostly supported by Democrats. Although, I should take that back. I think actually Marco Rubio supported it, when it first came out. So,
Mhm.
of
Mhm.
all people.
Mhm.
Uh, Not to slam Marco Rubio, of course, but but let me see. But yeah, I don't know. It seems, it's funny because you had all that momentum, but over the summer, I think even then, there were questions about the prospects of it, going through the Senate without managing those 60 votes to avoid a filibuster, and
Mhm.
I think even then, when it seemed unlikely that that was going to happen, it didn't really, other than maybe the rail labor unions, it didn't really seem to um, have much traction from other stakeholders. Obviously, the rail industry, um, I think, prefers to self regulate in general, and so, like, they're not necessarily
Mhm.
going to
Mhm.
push for it. They're going to, not to say that they're not going to pursue safety, but they have their own way of doing things. And then, of course, even though rail shippers, were in the discussions in crafting this rail safety bill, it's not necessarily something that they would push for either. And so you really just had, labor were the ones who were kind of interested in seeing this go through. And I suppose you could also say, um, you know, uh, I don't say community activists, but those who um, I don't say have a close connection to East Palestine, but just that idea
Mhm.
that
Mhm. Yeah.
community people pushing things forward. So
Yeah. I mean, I was surprised. I mean, I was surprised that it was as partisan as it was because it's just hard to stand up in Congress and be against safety. Like, even if you're generally against regulations, and, that's what surprised me in the rail industry. Sometimes it's more, like you said, I mean, based on geography than anything else. But we'll see. Maybe it comes to a vote next year. Maybe it doesn't. On that, you're also working on a couple of stories. I understand. Talking to the Short Line Association again. Is it Chuck Baker that you're talking with
Yeah,
again?
yeah,
Yeah. So we had Chuck
yeah.
on PSR some time ago. What was new with Chuck and the Short Line?
Yeah, so so I'm kind of towards the year end. We're kind of writing series of articles. One is just kind of looking at what was big in 2023, but also what stakeholders are looking at in 2024. And so I think a number of those issues, of course, are have been ongoing in 2023 and aren't necessarily going away. Of course, you have the rail safety legislation, but you have for shippers, you have reciprocal switching and how that's going to come along, especially with Chairman Marty Oberman of the Surface Transportation Board and not seeking another
Mhm.
term, and how that might affect the momentum of things before the board. For the labor unions, so I've so far I've interviewed several stakeholders and still have some other interviews lined up over the
Mhm.
next 2 weeks. But um, but yeah, Chuck Baker of the American Short Line and Regional Railroad Association was one of the people I've talked to, and of course for them it's one of the big issues. Of course, is the zero emissions rule for locomotives that was passed by the
Mhm.
California
Mhm.
Air Resources Board,
Mhm.
and of course their concern is that that rule could somehow um, influence or could also pop up in other states, if not influence how other states could potentially regulate uh, locomotive emissions. So
Mhm.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, lots of stuff happening.
Yeah, I mean that electric locomotive, like he gave some pretty sort of eye-popping stats on that when we interviewed him on PSR. He said that the short line railroads, they would typically buy locomotives that are used, that are several decades old, and they would usually be able to acquire one for about $100,000, considering that it is several decades old. New locomotive be, $2.5 million, $3 million, something like that. But these electric locomotives would be like $5 or $6 million, and so it would be a situation where potentially short line, you know, could they be required to buy these electric locomotives, just completely change the economics of the capital structure? Capital is required to run a short line, railroad. That's pretty big concern. The other thing that stood out when we interviewed him to me was that he was pretty complimentary on the rail service, and he said that the rail service, he had gotten a lot better, and he called out CSX specifically as ones where the railroads that were under his association, that American Short Line and Regional Railroad Association, that basically contracted with CSX, that they were very happy with the rail service. It'll be interesting to read your article with him, to see if that is still true on the rail service issue, and then. Similarly, with the American Chemistry Council, I think you're talking to them. We had them on PSR also, and their big thing, at least from what I recall from that interview, is that they were really looking forward to the reciprocal switching and having something there. I'm sure that they thought the proposed rule did not go far enough because a lot of those chemicals, there's really no alternative, rather than the railroad. So those will be up. Will they be up before the end of the year? We'll look forward to those articles.
I'm not really sure. It'll either be like at the end of the year, or like at the beginning of January. So, but fairly soon. It's just personally, it's just weird to think that it's December 5th already. So I'm like, oh, yeah, yeah. I'm still mentally stuck in
Yeah. So
September. Yeah, yeah, but yeah.
So everyone, if you're not already signed up for the FreightWaves Rail newsletter, just find one of Joanna's articles and go down to the bottom, and should be a link to sign up for those for that newsletter, and you'll never miss a FreightWaves Railroad article. So with that, hope everyone has a good one.